This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host Sampath. Bangladesh is in the midst of tumultuous change. After former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina fled the country, Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus has taken charge as chief advisor to an interim government. Meanwhile, with Hasina out and its top leadership of her party in hiding, the future of the Awami League looks uncertain. The Opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party is back in the reckoning, and so is the Jamaat-e-Islami. BNP leader and former Prime Minister Khalida Zia, who was under house arrest, is now a free woman. So, how do the people of Bangladesh understand these tectonic changes? What are their expectations from the interim government? And did Indian foreign policy miss a trick or two in responding to these changes in its neighbourhood? And what is the actual situation on the ground as of today with regard to the safety of minorities? For a fuller and more accurate perspective on the unfolding developments, we are joined by our correspondent Kallol Bhattacherjee, who is right now in Dhaka. Kallol, welcome back to In Focus. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sampath. Thank you so much for inviting me once again. And I think I'm appearing on your podcast for a second time in approximately a month. And so this is a great privilege, Sampath. Thank you so much.
Great, excellent to have you here again. So to start with, Kallol, you are there in Dhaka, I think for at least 2 days now. So what is the mood in the country that you're sensing? Are there protesters still out there on the streets? Are the Awami League leaders still being targeted? Or have things now more or less settled down and there is a different kind of a momentum right now?
Well, the protests have not stopped because protests are continuing and they are breaking out at a moment's notice in different parts of Dhaka every day. So, whether you talk about protests by students or workers or professionals, small shopkeepers and small time businessmen, they are breaking out every day in different locations in the city. Their demands that they seem to articulate is that there have been long pending issues that have not been addressed in the last several years, and now these issues are being taken up by the protesters. They are essentially a motley crowd, often mainly led
What kind
by.
of issues? What kind of issues? Because one for sitting outside, when my own sense was that the protests were directed at the Awami League leaders and leadership. Now they are gone. So who are they directing these protests to, and what are their demands?
Well, Awami League leadership was, of course, embodied in Sheikh Hasina, but then she was supported by this, very large infrastructure of her supporters, of businessmen, and this, whole overall power structure that existed in the bureaucracy, judiciary, banking sector, and all other sectors that one can imagine, because this whole apparatus is also being uprooted slowly, one day at a time. And it's not just the removal of Sheikh Hasina that this protest was aiming at. They were looking at the change of the Hasina system that had taken root in the last 1.5 decades. And therefore these protests are now targeting various big business houses, big banking honchos, and financial geniuses that who have been in the system for the last several years. And now these protests are targeting these people as the remains of the Hasina regime. So they are a daily incendiary moment that are erupting on the streets of Dhaka. And most interestingly, or perhaps in a reflection of the risks involved in this kind of a situation, the police and the law and order machinery are not supposed to address these sudden eruptions of rage and anger on the streets with any sort of display of strength, because the public's trust vis-a-vis the law enforcement authorities have taken a big hit over the last 2 months. As a result, there's a lot of concern and a lot of sensibilities involved in even the show of the mildest form of strength by the law enforcement authorities. So the protesters are being given as much space as possible so that they can basically vent out their anger. And therefore, when you see a protest breaking out in the middle of Dhaka, in Karwan Bazaar, or in the universities, and if they step out onto the streets, then the law and order machinery doesn't act on them, and they allow them all the space and the time that they require, till the time they are exhausted, and they perhaps they calm down on their own. But so far so good, that these protests are not going out of control. But the law enforcement authorities are not supposed to work, not supposed to act, and are not supposed to display firepower, more importantly. So the police are essentially standing guard without displaying any any gun or any automatic weapons. So it's a very precarious sort of a peace prevailing on the streets of Dhaka, and it's all being driven by this desire to uproot the entire Hasina mechanism that was built over this part of the world over the last, say, 30 years or so. Because starting with 1996, it was Prime Minister Hasina who had her first tenure as Prime Minister in Dhaka. So from the 1990s till now, whatever the Awami League was meant to represent is being questioned.
Right. I mean, you've spoken about the Awami League or Sheikh Hasina's system now, and the protesters are sort of wanting that to be like taken away from the roots, so to speak. Now, are all these protesters disrupting normal life? Did you have trouble moving around? Are there lots of problems with transportation, etc., because of these protests, or they are being a little bit sensible in in sort of managing this protest to the extent possible, so that normal life is not disrupted?
Well, I mean, it really, what you can imagine, that in the middle of this mega city, which is really full of activities all throughout the day and night, you have these protests erupting. So the traffic goes for a six, and so does normal life. So people cannot move around. You cannot do your normal things, and the normal life is being delayed. You can't really experience life as it existed maybe sometime in the distant past in Dhaka at present. So yes, I mean, there is absolutely no certainty, no stability. I mean, you can tell someone that you'd be reaching at so and so time, but you can't really reach there because of huge protests breaking out and stopping the entire traffic flow. So this is happening at any moment. So you just step into the streets and you are greeted by this huge roar, which is accompanied by honking vehicles and etc., because nobody can move anywhere. So you have protests, and you have traffic jams, and you have the rains. So you have a total breakdown kind of a situation here, which somehow is being managed by the law and order officials, and perhaps a lot of empathy and caution by the interim government led by Professor Muhammad Yunus.
Right. So, what exactly is the interim government's mandate, Kallol? Is there any clarity on what the people want from this interim government? When one had an understanding that it was supposed to be around for 90 days, but is there any kind of a consensus on extension of its tenure, maybe up to the time of whenever they plan to hold elections? Is it likely, for instance, that the interim government could be around for about 1.5 to 2 years until there is a greater clarity in terms of which are the political parties that are going to be able to contest, etc.?
Well, Bangladesh has a tradition of caretaker government, but that tradition of caretaker government was nixed by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina in 2011, when she brought in parliamentary legislation, and that tradition was amended and it was basically dismissed. So it doesn't have anymore that tradition of caretaker government. So what we have essentially in Bangladesh today is an interim government. So the idea of 90 days being allocated for a caretaker government is not, practically speaking, effective in this particular case, as it is not a caretaker government, but an interim government. So here you really can't apply the rules that were meant for caretaker government and were eliminated, because and now we have an entirely new system called the interim government, not a caretaker government. So here, that 90 days period is not applicable. So to begin with, there is a lot of flexibility from from established political parties like the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which is right now the biggest political party in Bangladesh and biggest overground political organization in Bangladesh, which is actively mobilizing its supporters across the country, because Awami League has been cornered, and the regime of Sheikh Hasina has been overthrown. As long as the BNP is concerned, I mean, as far as BNP is concerned, and as far as other smaller political parties that are aligned with BNP, even like say Jamaat-e-Islami and others, they have given this particular interim government what they say is the reasonable amount of time, and they are saying that we don't want that they don't want elections to be held after 90 days, but they are okay if elections are held after some delay, but within the reasonable period of time, though they are not really making it clear what that reasonable amount of time would be like, whether it would be a year or a couple of years, etc. But they are saying that there has to be two forms of reform. One is, of course, a foundational reform that the interim government would be required to implement, and then there would be some sort of systemic reform that would be implemented once an elected or a democratic establishment comes into play through the election. But before that election, they would say that these foundational changes and reforms
Like,
can be
what do you mean by
made.
foundational reform, Kallol? I mean, when we chatted yesterday, you mentioned something about the kinds of debates which were happening on the TV channels in terms of, what kind of a political system they would want going forward. So, because everybody you said is fed up with this two-party system, which has sort of corroded their democratic fabric over the last 2 decades. It's not really delivering for the people. So, what is this foundational reform, and what are the systemic reform that they hope to get once a democratic government is in place? Like, what are the broad contours of this entire discussion that's happening, which you've been hearing in Dhaka? If you can tell us something about that.
Well, the foundational reform is, of course, one is the cleaning of the economy so that at least the prices could be brought down and the common people could have an easier life. That's one of the demands that I'm hearing from various people that I meet. And the other, of course, is that the cleaning up of the political system, whether it is the party oriented political system, or the more executive oriented or technocrat oriented political system, so that there is these opportunities of favoritism and nepotism are eliminated completely in future, irrespective of the form of the democratic government that comes into play. So they are talking about eliminating these options, that have given the elected representatives in the past the opportunity to abuse the system, so that if anybody is elected in future as the prime minister or as the head of state, he or she is not allowed to get elected multiple times. That is also one of the ideas that is coming up. So these are some of the tinkering with the foundational pillars of Bangladesh Republic that some people are envisaging. But of course, as far as any greater reform, for example, the changes in the constitution and etc., that the political parties are saying that would have to be implemented once the democratic the process kicks in after the completion of the time of the interim government.
Right. Now, the process of a new democratic government being formed, and I'm just a little curious how that could happen, because the Awami League, I'm assuming, is more or less finished in terms of at least the next election, because their leader is out of the country, the top leadership has gone underground. So they don't really have any credibility left. So you have the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and you have the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is aligned with the BNP, and then there's nobody else. So who are they going to contest against? When is Muhammad Yunus going to start his own party? Like, who will the BNP contest against if there is an election? Like, what is it going to look like?
Well, again, these are the conundrums of democracy in Bangladesh today, because we are really looking at not just the formation of the government, but also the formation of the state itself. Because right now, as you step onto the streets, say you sometimes feel as if the state itself is not present at moments of when the citizens require it. Now, you have on the one hand, of course, you talked about Muhammad Yunus. Now he is 84 years old and he is a giant institution. And under his shadow, there are a lot of these, young student leaders and a lot of activists and very bright civil society representatives like, Saida Rizwana Hassan, who is a Magsaysay Award winner from Bangladesh. They are all articulating some of the very critical demands of Bangladesh, whether on livelihood, whether on climate change and all those domains. But also with sort of shared rivers with India. They are articulating some of these very important demands of Bangladeshi people. And what is happening is that these younger people may at some point coalesce into a new political front, depending on the kind of dynamics that they develop over the period of the operation of the interim government. That is one option. The other, of course, is that there are these established political organizations like the BNP, Jamaat-e-Islami, and others. They will become stronger in this period because now they are able to operate without fear of the crackdown of the government machinery because the Awami League has been thrown out. But again, we also have to remember that as the interim government spends the time that is allocated to it by the political parties like BNP, the reasonable amount of time, the interim government is also being tested on and also being experimented with by the population of Bangladesh, and they are continuously being tested vis-a-vis the performance of Sheikh Hasina on certain fronts. So when we say that Army League is finished, we also have to remember that Awami League is not just Sheikh Hasina. Awami League is also the idea of liberation of Bangladesh and the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, which is not always limited to Sheikh Hasina and her father Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, because there were many other people like Tajuddin Ahmed and many others who were also part of the liberation process of Bangladesh in 1971. So today, when you go on the streets of Dhaka and other places near Dhaka, you can actually see people talk to you about whether Muhammad Yunus is as strong as a leader of Bangladesh should be. And many people would also tell you that the interim government may not be as strong because they want the leader also to be strong. Now, by strong, they mean someone who can control. So this is a very ironical situation here that where on the one hand they are happy because Sheikh Hasina has been overthrown, but at the same time there also is a longing for a strong leader who can handle the complications of Bangladeshi existence.
Right. I mean, it is indeed pretty ironic and rather strange that within a month of having gotten rid of a leader who had nothing lacking in terms of being strong, you are again like there is a yearning for a strong leader. I mean, very strange indeed. Now, let's move on. Just changing gears a bit, Kallol, to a question which a lot of people in India are sort of very concerned about, if not obsessed with. I mean, and which is, I mean, we do have a tendency in large sections in India to look at things in politics in Bangladesh through the prism of minority safety. So, can you tell us exactly? There's been a lot of rumor mongering. There's been a lot of fact checks. BBC has done a fact check on various rumors and reports of attacks on Hindus and Hindu property that we keep hearing about. So, I was just curious: are these attacks directed at these individuals or properties because they were Hindus, or were they sort of triggered by the fact that these were entities associated with the Awami League, against whom, of course, there was a lot of legitimate anger. So, how exactly? What is the sense you're getting, having been around in the country for now?
Well, Sampath, first of all, communal violence is not really new in South Asia, irrespective of the country that we are talking about. But the issue here, especially in this particular case over the last month and a half, is this: that the violence that is that is being shown on the Indian TV screens and Indian social media, that is supposed to have been perpetrated against the Hindu community of Bangladesh, has taken place at a moment of collective trauma in the history of Bangladesh, at a moment when the state was literally not there, at a moment when there was an uprising against a government. Now, this is a very different from, say, for example, the 2022 attacks on the Durga Puja pandals in Brahmanbaria and Chittagong when there was a functioning government in Dhaka. And you could take up that matter with Sheikh Hasina. You could have a conversation with Prime Minister Hasina because there was a government in Dhaka, and you could ask that government for certain, frank answers that what is really going on with the minorities in Bangladesh. If Sheikh Hasina is in power, then you could really seek explanations and from that government. But today the issue is, at a moment of collective trauma, when violence is inflicted, like we saw, there were violence incidents of violence inflicted against the Sikhs and the Hindus in Afghanistan when the Taliban came to power. But then the issue was that the violence was not just limited to the Sikhs and Hindus of Afghanistan. It was primarily the Muslims who were basically, attacking other Muslims. The majority of the targets of the Taliban takeover at that point were essentially the Afghan Muslims. The critical issue here that I'm really pointing at is that you really have no one to complain to, because there is a total collapse of state power, and it is during that moment that these attacks have taken place. And even today, as I'm speaking to you, the state power hasn't really coalesced to become a credible force or deterrent force. So who do you really raise these questions to? So I think, our, I mean, I wouldn't say our, perhaps some of the commentators and some of the online activists who are talking about the issues of minority rights in Bangladesh, they are forgetting the fact that they are dealing with an entity which is right now in a kind of a proto state formation, because you really have no one to raise these issues and discuss these issues with. Of course you have the interim government, but let us remember this is an interim government of a state which is literally wobbling. So and also the minority rights is one issue, but here the majority of the victims are also, we have to remember, Muslims. So I mean, I really feel that there is a greater requirement in
What
the
do you
Indian.
mean, Kallol? We are talking about the safety of minorities here, but you're saying that the majority of victims are Muslims. What exactly do you mean by that?
Because the main fight is against the Awami League activists who are established in various wings of the state, and they are, as one can imagine, in it is a Bangladesh has been a Muslim majority country without being theocratic, and they also have a religious identity. And since we are talking about religious identity through your question, that we have to remember that these processes that are taking place, whether these are protest oriented, or by direct actions being taken by the interim government, law and order actions against former ministers and others, these are all mostly Muslim ministers and Muslim deputy ministers. So we have to really look at that
So
as
would I be so? Just to paraphrase what you are saying, trying to point out, Kalol, when you say that in these violent incidents, the majority of the victims are Muslims, do I then take it to mean that this violence is not communally directed? Because the majority of victims are Muslims and the minority are Hindus, would suggest that these are not primarily directed with a communal motive, but more of a political motive directed at political opponents and so on.
Absolutely, because we are talking about collapse of the state, and when we talk of collapse of the state, we talk of the collapse of the state power. So what we are witnessing is basically contest for capturing the power of the state. And here the issue of community and other identities are secondary. The main drive is to capture power, and in this condition, the religious identities and other issues really fall on the background, because ultimately it is whoever can grab whatever. It's kind of animal kingdom, the Thomas Hobbes description of a state of nature, where life is nasty, brutish and short, and that's universally true for all communities and all individuals.
Right. Okay. So in this whole scenario, Kulal, I was just wondering, a question on Indian government's foreign policy with regard to Bangladesh. I mean, a very important country in the neighborhood. Going by what you are saying so far, has sort of fallen into a proto-state kind of a zone, and now you have the former prime minister sitting in India. There are several murder cases against her in her home country. There might be demands for her to be extradited, and the new regime, even if it's an interim one, may or may not like her to be politically active. She may not want to be politically dormant while she's here. So, a very complicated situation for India. Do you think Indian foreign policy has perhaps missed a trick or two with regard to Bangladesh in the last maybe 1 year or so? Because they may have, I mean, as a predominant power in the region, it was perhaps up to our foreign affairs mavens to sort of know what's happening, maybe warn Sheikh Hasina about what's happening, what's where the country is headed, and maybe I don't know. Do you think we got too comfortable with Sheikh Hasina that we really didn't do our best, or did our perceptions of what's happening in Bangladesh get distorted by our preoccupation, domestic preoccupation with Hindutva, for instance? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you so much for asking these very important questions, Sampath. My point is that it is not just a failure of the Indian foreign policy, or it is not even a foreign failure of, say, the Indian intelligence agencies. It is really a failure of the thinking. And because I say that the thinking of about South Asia, about thinking about India's neighbors and the neighborhood, that is where the failure will have to be traced. Because just to give an example, today I was meeting this very important person from the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and I asked him if he was ever invited to any of these big conclaves that are annually held in India, and not just in one place, but in multiple locations. These talk shops and conclaves and dialogues and these, very, very interesting platforms are organized every year. And he said to me that not just he, but also none of his party members or party leaders were ever invited to be a speaker in any of the conclaves that Indian External Affairs Ministry or other organizations associated with the government of India in some manner organize every year. And he started telling me that that our foreign policy, rather the Indian foreign policy establishment, should wake up and smell the coffee. Because when we look at, as you mentioned, that if India got too comfortable with Sheikh Hasina government, the issue is that as the major power of South Asia, or the biggest power of South Asia, which India definitely is, given its strategic placing and its stretch and its power and wealth, comparative to other countries, and also its global positioning. I mean, India has the right to speak to all stakeholders in the neighboring countries, and they are also very often very happy to engage India. And all sides of Bangladesh politics have been reaching out, as they have been telling me, to the government of India and its interlocutors, but they have never gotten a kind of a welcome. So these people have never been engaged. You never really saw them addressing any of the public meetings or think tanks in India. And today, suddenly, the person who was the closest to Indian state in Bangladesh is not there. So there is this requirement to reach out to, say, BNP and other political formations in the left, even in the center. But then how do you engage them if you have never invited them? And even when we talk about Professor Yunus, when Professor Yunus was facing multiple legal cases and being threatened with jail terms, there was not really a very vocal opposition to Sheikh Hasina's anti-Yunus policy in those days. So these are all facts that are now being presented before the Indian state. And today, of course, the Indian High Commissioner went and met Professor Yunus, and it was a courtesy visit, and there has been nice conversation that the Bangladeshi interim government has described as cordial. So this is some sort of a beginning, but the main issue is this sort of beginnings could have been done with many other smaller stakeholders in Bangladesh. And in that way, India could have been better prepared if India had already activated all these dialogue channels over the past, not just 1 year, but multiple years. Because the Sheikh Hasina government has been in existence for now 15 to 16 years continuously, and India did not cultivate any of these forces that were kind of not very happy with her. So I think that is a time that's not been used very wisely as far as these multiple forces are concerned that are now active on the surface and that are now demanding engagement with India. Now, yesterday, the Chinese ambassador to Bangladesh took a delegation to meet the leadership of Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and they are describing it as the biggest meeting with Bangladesh Nationalist Party over the last decade. Now, so one has to really look at these fast moving developments that are taking place in Dhaka and say that if India can at all catch up with these changes, because India really needs to move fast in this kind of circumstance.
Right. Thank you for sort of elaborating on this aspect, Kallol. I mean, it's very interesting that the Chinese have gone there with a big delegation to meet the BNP leadership, and India is, I don't know whether we're going to play catch up on that score. Now, one last question, Kallol. We're running out of time before we wrap up. Now, when we have, to some extent, or maybe to a large extent, seen Sheikh Hasina as some kind of a secular bulwark against, Islamist nationalism in Bangladesh and so on and so forth. Now that she's gone, are we going to be looking at some kind of more of a religious overtone in Bangladesh politics? Is that what the Indian foreign policy establishment is worried about? Like, my question, let me rephrase it: is can we expect more of continuity in India-Bangladesh relations, or is there going to be a reconfiguration of India-Bangladesh relations going forward? Because you have spoken so much about there being a proto-state and the Bangladeshi people wanting a lot of changes. They want to break down the Hasina system. So, can you break down the Sheikh Hasina system and not have a reconfiguration of India-Bangladesh relations, which was premised on that Hasina system?
Well, there are continuities between India and Bangladesh, like trade and people-to-people contact, the medical tourism, the educational engagements that will definitely continue. We have language, we have culture, we have television programs that are being shot in Bangladesh, and there are Bangladesh television programs that are being shot in India. So these continuities will be there and these can't be disrupted. Even in the interim government, we have to remember that very recently there was this very interesting film which was directed by I think I'm forgetting his name right now, Bharadwaj, Vishal Bharadwaj, and this very interesting cast of character which included the Bangladesh actress Badhon and also Tabu. It was called Khufia. It came on Netflix and was widely watched and discussed. So these continuities will be there. I know you can't really discount them, but the issue is that can these things go on uninterrupted when the political core is somehow undergoing a metamorphosis in a very radical manner, in a very uncertain manner. So the issue therefore is, if India Bangladesh relation can survive, these continuities can really go on uninterrupted, despite the fact that the core of the Bangladesh state is now evolving quite rapidly. And that is a big challenge because India will have to really, step up all its diplomatic and its business actions so that all the misunderstandings that existed are removed very, very quickly. And India could put its acts together as far as Bangladesh is concerned.
Right. Thank you so much, Kallol. I think you've given us a pretty clear idea of all the complications that are sort of unfolding on the ground. And I think it's going to be very interesting times ahead, a lot of challenges for Indian foreign policy as well, and for the people of Bangladesh as well, who want a clear break, a clean break with the Hasina system and perhaps a more responsive regime in place in the days going forward. Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure talking to you, Kallol.
Thank you so much, Sampath.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.